Lisa,
Yes, baby girl.
when I grow up, I want to be a womenace to society.
Then so shall you be. Hey, this is Lisa Landry. Welcome back to A Menace to Society. I am so stoked about today's guest. She's an adjunct professor of sexual violence law at New England Law Boston, where she's taught for 15 years, an impact litigator whose work in the state and federal courts around the country has changed the law to improve protections for women's and children's constitutional rights. Please welcome to the podcast, Wendy Murphy.
So good to be with you today, Lisa.
I'm so happy that you're here. You know, I've seen your tweets on Twitter and you blow me away because you are so authentic.
I think that all people ought to be authentic, and some try and some don't. You know, as an activist and an impact litigator, I think I'm probably more driven than most to say things that are a little bolder because I've been frustrated for too long. Like a lot of people who do women's rights work, you get frustrated after a while and people don't listen very well and stuff doesn't get done, and the moments for being polite have come and gone in my career. I'm just not very good at it anymore.
I understand that frustration. You know, you see so much that you can't understand why this is still happening, and you're just kind of like, well, why be quiet about it any longer?
Yeah, you know, it's 2019. I like to start off most of my conversations with people by saying, why do we have to debate this? Why is this even a debate? Why am I wasting my time debating something that ought to be resolved and ought to have been resolved a long time ago? And sometimes that's a little off-putting because there are people who say things back to me like women's rights, you know, have progressed and things take time and change takes time. And I do understand that. I see the long trail, if you will, of history and how changes can be slow. But when you're talking about something as basic as equality under the Constitution and the Equal Rights Amendment and its simplicity in terms of just making it clear that women are not second-class citizens, when you see that issue and people want to talk about the two sides, I don't have patience for that, because some things are debatable and some things do take time, and society doesn't really move as quickly as they can on all sorts of things. But on basic equality, on basic constitutional rights that have only to do with whether you as a female are entitled to the same legal protections as other people, that should not be debatable. There ought be no discussion. And when there are discussions about it, when people come up with these excuses about why we have to be patient, I just push back. I don't even want to hear it. And I think a lot of people are reaching that point now where to debate is to delay. And so we're done. That's how I feel.
I feel the same way as you. Of course, I don't have a legal mind and I don't have your resume. I've not accomplished anywhere near what you've done. But I do get frustrated too, because how long do we wait and what is the impasse? Why are we still obstructed from this basic right of constitutional rights?
Yeah. Well, and let me be clear, Lisa. It's not just about lawyers and resumes making arguments that are complicated because they involve legal doctrines that are not linguistically and otherwise accessible to lay people who don't understand. The work that you do is just as important, maybe in some ways more important, because it's a political question as much as it's a legal question, this idea of women's equality. And we have to work together not only across disciplines and across classes, but across all lines, and find that common ground that bonds us, which is just being female and being second-class people and understanding how that affects us in our lives. It might affect you differently than it affects me, but the common glue is that we are affected. And we're not very good, I think, at coming together around that. But I think the answer to the question, why are we still stuck, is deeply connected to the fact that we aren't mobilized. So it is kind of the flip side of the coin, I guess. We're still stuck because for hundreds of years in this country, to the extent women have tried to come together around women's issues, whether it's suffrage and the right to vote or workplace discrimination, violence against women, and certainly the ERA, when women try to mobilize and come together as female and really just stay tight and focused about the nature of being female as the central glue, if you will, we get divided. We get divided by forces that are bigger than us. Moneyed interests, political interests, and those two things are really not different, can and do come to bear on us in ways that are hard to resist. I'll just use as an example what happened during suffrage. In the early days of suffrage, women and slaves and black people all worked together around abolition and freedom and equality for all of us. You know, it was not equality for black people separate from equality for women. It was all kind of the same soup. And then pretty soon into that, what I call the first civil rights era, which was long before the one we know about in the 60s and 70s, but during the first rise up, if you will, of women's rights advocates and abolitionists and so forth, we were together. And then we were divided, and the division was not of our choosing. It was imposed upon us, and we were soon having a battle, black people versus females, who's entitled to more and better rights. And women were criticized and criticized for sounding audacious if they dared suggest that their rights were just as important and so forth. And, you know, it's unfortunate that we allowed that divide to happen and kind of indulged it as a legitimate false narrative, when it was, in fact, in my opinion, a false narrative. But it's been a problem ever since. So we're going back a couple hundred years of women feeling like we're having a battle with an interest group that isn't aligned with us, when in fact, of course, we do share the same goals and interests and values, and political and moneyed interests are responsible usually for causing us to feel like we are either in a pecking order along with or literally in a battle against other interest groups. So flash ahead to ERA, we somewhat surmounted the race versus gender fight. Somewhat. And that's partly because I think minority women have taken up the mantle of the ERA and have done a tremendous and a wonderful job taking the lead on really pushing for women's equality as an essential right that they care about, in addition to their concerns about racism. But now I think we're seeing new battle lines being drawn between women and the gay community, and it's really frustrating. It's been extremely frustrating for me to watch it happen. It's hard to push back, but in fact there are gay rights groups that, when they fight for their rights, which of course I support all the time, but when gay people fight for gay rights, to some extent that feels exclusionary, that somehow doesn't cover or include the interests of women, or women's rights as a category of people. And I think that's kind of the new race versus gender fight, is gay versus female fight. And it's unfortunate because, of course, as with race, we share the same values, we share the same interests, we share the same goals. So it's been difficult, to say the least, to transcend that. And I'm seeing it more and more. And right now, I think in the fight for ERA, we're seeing a lot of gay rights groups not supporting ERA, at least not aggressively supporting ERA, for reasons that, you know, are frustrating, because I think we have to be allies with each other and really aggressively resist this pressure that keeps getting imposed upon women that feels divisive. We have to resist that and say, you will not divide us. We will not be divided. You can try to tell us that we're different from each other, that gay people are different from female people and trans people and so forth. You can try to say that, but we're not different, and we will not be divided, and we will fight as a singular force, and we will win the ERA. That's the theme I think we really need to be working on.
I agree with you. We need that ERA ratified, definitely. And it does disappoint me as an observer. It seems like the media is partially responsible for driving these wedges between these different factions who all have worked together previously. Like, I noticed, you know, I'm queer. My girlfriend is a woman of color. And as two queer women, we are being told that we are supposed to support trans rights. It's very important. It is very important to support trans rights. These people are vilified. They are murdered at a high rate. They are beaten. They are ostracized, often made homeless, kicked out of their communities. They need to be supported. However, at the same time, we don't have rights as women who are born as women, and I'm supposed to make sure that a man who feels more comfortable as a woman is protected as a woman, when that doesn't even entitle you to making the same amount of money for your salary.
Yeah, there are so many ways in which that divide is problematic, and it's difficult to say to any other quote-unquote type of person in society that they ought to be not so focused on their own individual sense of self and kind of see the big picture and really think politically, always think politically about the big picture and how we all benefit when we don't feel divided. I think the trans conversation is really intense and difficult for women. It's very difficult for women, and it's very funny. Language is difficult for people. Things change a lot. I think the interesting thing about the trans community's isolated concerns, as opposed to, how their concerns relate to and overlap with other people's issues, I think that they do suffer in some unique ways. But I think what's funny is that if we could flash ahead 50 years from now, would we even have any of these subcategories, or would we all be comfortable being fluid in some ways, so you don't have to just be one thing, that you can always be multiple things. The more diverse we become, the more it seems that's an inevitability of our species. I mean, when a person is a mixed race individual, who are we to say you should identify as black, or you should identify as white, or you should identify as mixed, or whatever the label is? I mean, what if President Obama on Monday feels like identifying as black, and on Tuesday he identifies as white, and we all look at him objectively and say, no, you're actually mixed. I, as an observer, see you as mixed. Whose decision controls? I think in a cultural sense, there has to be an objective way of categorizing people. There just has to be, because humans have to be managed. From an individualistic perspective, the objective observer's opinion is irrelevant. And I think it's a quandary. But I also think it could be very liberating in the future. We're not there yet, though. And I think, take a step back and let's just kind of sit where we are and stew about where we are on the ERA. The Equal Rights Amendment, which does nothing but prohibit discrimination on the basis of sex by state and federal governments. That's all it does. It forbids discrimination based on sex, period. Getting that in the Constitution should not be controversial, and of course will benefit all communities, whatever you call yourself. And I don't care how many letters of the alphabet come along after LGBTQ. I don't care how many. If you elevate sex to its rightful place on par with the rest of the world, the rest of the country, that elevates all categories of orientation and gender by definition, because it gives women's, females' voices more power. Everything females speak up about, care about, fight for becomes more meaningful because our voices weigh more. Our voices have more heft. And the idea that we can't appreciate even that simple point, that politically speaking, giving female voices equal stature as men in the law, that is good for all people. That's a no-brainer. That issue right there, that point right there, should be enough to keep us all bonded around making the ERA a reality. And we're not there. We're not doing it. We're very divided, and it's crazy.
We are very divided. We're fighting each other over bullshit, excuse my language. When we have huge things on our plate, we're being told to look over at the buffet at the little thing on the napkin and get mad about that. I don't even know if that analogy makes any sense.
The red herring stuff is tired and old, and it's an effective strategy that's worked for hundreds of years. I think of the abortion nonsense coming out of the South is a big fat red herring meant to distract women's attention away from ERA, where we're so close.
Oh, yeah.
And get us talking about silliness and spending all of our time, money, and resources talking about abortion rather than staying focused on this far bigger fish called ERA.
Well, see,
Absolutely.
I think it's all interrelated. Myself personally, I know I'm not supposed to say this because I'm a liberal, but I'm morally opposed to abortion. However, it's not my job to tell people what their morals should be. This is a free society, allegedly, and you cannot tell people what they can or cannot do based on your own value system. And furthermore,
I think abortion is a lot like any other issue that people, for either moral or religious reasons, feel strongly about. If you, because of your religion, think that people ought to wear hats on Friday, I can be okay with that. It's okay with me, But I'm not wearing one, right?
Right.
And that's the same point that you're making about another person's body. Your right to swing your fist ends before it hits me in the nose. Your right to swing your religion ends before it hits me in the nose. Your right to swing your morals ends before it hits me in the nose. And I like to say about rapists, because they don't get this at all, your right to swing your penis ends before it hits me in the vagina. That's just the nature of individual freedom and self-determination. Your rights don't go beyond you.
Okay, so do you think that they won't get this ERA ratified? It might go this time, I don't know, but if it does go and we have now full protection under the law, that means, oh my gosh, we're going to have to lock up racists and rapists. We're going to have to, rapists will actually have to pay.
Yeah.
And, women will have to get paid equally. So that means companies will have to put out more money. And if women have full protection under the law, we're going to have more recourse to protect ourselves. And that means that men are going to lose their God-given right to abuse us.
I'm not sure I would blame God. I would blame religion.
I'm sorry. Yeah, that was my intention, but I didn't speak clearly.
Well, no, but it's an important distinction in the sense that religion is obviously a man-made, culturally constructed control dogma, bunch of nonsense, in my opinion, that is good for people in some ways, and people like it, and they can choose to obey it, and that's fine. But let's remember that prior to the late 1800s, no religion was opposed to abortion. Abortion was legal and not controversial, and it was only in the late 1800s, after the country incorporated and became a company, basically, that the number of births that happened in the United States became economically relevant. In other words, we as a nation could now leverage births, the numbers of births, the human bodies that were being born here. We could leverage them to get more money from foreign banks. And not surprisingly, after that happened, which was in, I think, 1871, that we became a corporation, that this country became a corporation, right after that, all the states, one by one, started criminalizing abortion for obvious reasons.
Yeah, we needed more property. We needed more property.
Get more bodies, yeah. Right? More bodies, more money. I mean, it's always about money, isn't it?
Yeah.
So I think if you put it in context and then say, and so along came religion. After we criminalized abortion, along came religion. Not all religions, but some religions started talking about abortion as being murder. But I think the point is that it's not an organic religious concept. It is a political, created, constructed, obviously for economic reasons, manufactured idea about women's bodies. It's not worth the obedience some people give it. Now, I respect your right to feel however you want about it. I don't particularly care if people choose to be religious or moral or however they feel about abortion. That's not my business. It is definitely my business when that becomes, a government decision, and the government's role in legitimizing subjugation of women by blaming religion doesn't make it any better.
No, it doesn't. Not at all.
Worse.
It does make it worse.
Worse.
It makes it way worse, in my opinion, too. This whole thing, too, I'm from Louisiana originally, and that abortion ban that they are going to put into effect, where even rape and incest survivors are not able to make a choice as to what they want to do in their situation if they become pregnant because of their predator. I think I read 62% of girls who are raped or molested, it's by a family member or a close friend of the family. That means that a lot of these babies who will be born, theoretically, in Louisiana are going to be rape babies, incest babies. These women or girls have no decision into the process as to whether or not they want to have these children. And then they're saddled with somebody who preyed upon them for the next 18 years. And I don't think that this is anything that any woman or girl should have to live through without making her own choice, especially. But to me, it doesn't seem like the women of Louisiana are being protected at all, because they're also not going to give any money to prenatal care. They're not giving any extra money to sex education. They're not giving any extra money to foster care while they're enacting this ban. And for me, it just seems like they just want to increase white births in a state where the demographic is changing, and they want to make sure they can keep enough white folk being born.
Well, makes sense to me. Yeah, I mean, it's always about money. It's always about money.
Mm-hmm.
And you just laid out a lot of really important points. Forcing births happens to also control women's bodies, which has always been a male entitlement that self carries a significant amount of value, economic value. Male supremacy, of course, carries with it a significant amount of value. And if women were actually liberated from the state's power over their bodies with regard to birth, that would affect male supremacy. Of course it would. I mean, I think there are similar feelings out there about ERA and violence against women that probably make sense, in the sense that if we have ERA in place, because women will then become entitled to fully equal protection of the law. They now get only second-class equal protection of the law, so unequal protection of the law. But to the extent we get fully equal protection of the law, then the failure to effectively prevent and redress and punish violence against women is going to be subject to recourse in the courts, and women are going to be able to complain about it much more so than they can now when, for example, prosecutors just reject 90% of the rape cases on the grounds that, the sky is blue or the grass is green, which they can do now. The prosecutors can currently refuse to prosecute rape and domestic violence cases for no reason at all and not be held to account. Well, if they do that under ERA, they can be held to account. They can be sued.
Right.
They can.
They're going to be liable.
Can be forced to, they can be liable.
Yep.
And they're worried about that.
That's
and
what's up.
It's a little bit absurd to think about a prosecutor being worried about getting in trouble for doing a terrible job, disproportionately so, redressing violence against women. You would think, a prosecutor would say, boy, that would be terrific, because then we'll all do a better job dealing with violence against women, and then there'll be less rape and domestic violence. But it's actually government officials who are saying, we don't want to be held to account.
Well, no, a lot of them are rapists and pedos themselves. I mean, we're all seeing the stories break. We're all, watching Twitter and looking online to see what's going on now with the Epstein thing, and seeing all these politicians who took money, knowing who he and what he is, and all of these prosecutors who let him go, and all. It's sickening. But I don't think people understand that is happening in every county. Not on this scale, but this is happening in your own community. There's somebody in your neighborhood who's been raped and nobody's going to help her. There's a child who's being molested by his father. Nobody's going to do anything to help that child. And this is all affecting everybody, because this is where we're getting the mass shootings, the school shootings, the overdosing, the suicides, all this violence is coming. Not all of it, but a great majority of it is coming out of these domestic violence situations that could be handled by our courts. But the people in charge of our courts often are doing the same things, or their buddies are doing the same things, and they don't want to enforce laws that will basically make them have to enforce law too.
No, I think it is epidemic, and it's also something we're not comfortable talking about, which leads further to the epidemic. You can't really expect the public to care about something that it doesn't know about. And the media does contribute to that. You're right about that. But the media is controlled by corporate interests, and corporate interests are controlled by the same wealth and power that control the fight against ERA. I mean, there's a lot of money. There's a lot of hidden money against ERA, and I think some of the hidden money is being used to fund some groups that hold themselves out as being pro-ERA. It's that bad.
It really is that bad. We're being gaslit by a lot of our people that we trust. There's a lot of shills out there. Yes, ma'am.
The gaslighting. Yeah, I mean, the gaslighting is, and it sounds legitimate, because it's coming from someone who's wrapped up in the mantle of your cause, and which makes it even harder to penetrate and show and expose. But the idea that there's a lot of violence behind closed doors isn't new. There's been violence against women and children in families for a zillion years, and for a long time we didn't prosecute it. We didn't characterize it as a public concern. We liked to privatize it and see if we could, figure it out in the sense that we'll send you some family services, we'll get you some kind of therapy. In other words, there's been some public support for the idea that these sorts of things can be worked out with therapy and family counseling and so forth. But I think we're starting to finally realize that that act of privatizing violence behind closed doors is, in a sense, the fuel that drives the machine that then creates the next generation and the next generation and the next generation of the same behavior. And the lack of comfort that people feel even talking about whether violence behind closed doors ought to be, and frankly is, if you read the law, the public's business, even that is frustratingly not on the top of the list of agenda items when we meet and talk about issues with women's groups. So I don't care if it's the feminist majority or any of the equal rights amendment groups that are out there right now claiming to care deeply about issues pertaining to women's equality and all that relates to inequality. When the issue of violence comes up, there's an awful lot of silence. There's a lot of silence. And I find that probably the most troubling of all, because to me, violence is the measuring stick, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you are working on any issue related to the status of women in society or their well-being, you can talk about equal pay all day long. Women who are being raped and beaten, they're not thinking about equal pay. And they're not thinking about, women's soccer matches. They're being brutalized on a daily basis because they are female. Violence against women is the top priority in terms of the moral imperative. What should we be thinking about as the type of injury that women suffer that best reflects whether they're doing okay in society? Equal pay is not really the measuring stick. Violence is the measuring stick. And the numbers, in terms of what the studies have shown over the years, the numbers of raped and abused women have been abysmal and have gone up and up and up in the past, 50 years, which tells you something. It tells you something that we're so bad as a country at dealing with the real issues that matter to women that we can't even protect them from being sexually and physically brutalized and beaten and killed on a daily basis.
Yeah.
4 to 5 women are killed from abuse in this country, and we're so bad at dealing with women's suffering that we can't even stop them and protect them, frankly, from being brutalized and killed. If we can't deal with that, if we can't fix that problem, nothing else matters. So I don't like it when people talk about equal pay and Time's Up this and time. Time's Up as an organization is extremely well funded. That alone makes me very nervous. But more to the point, they don't support ERA. And how can you claim to be a women's organization with millions of dollars? You are out there, putting yourself out there, claiming that you're working on issues that matter to women. You prop yourself up as the voice of issues related to the suffering women endure in the workplace. And you don't support ERA, and you don't even characterize women's suffering as the product of their inequality, the product of explicit sex discrimination. So the language they're using, the topics they're choosing to cover, the silence on ERA, and we're supposed to like Time's Up, right? We're supposed to support and like this group.
They're fighting for us, Wendy. They're fighting for us.
They're not fighting for us.
No, I know.
That's the kind of dangerous propaganda that causes us not to succeed when we're fighting for ERA. I'm very unapologetic myself about when you know you have inequality, nothing else matters enough that you should not be prioritizing inequality. This is the only issue. So anyone running for president right now, for example, if they don't talk first and foremost about the ERA, they don't deserve my vote. That's how I feel. And if you're out there as a leader and you're saying that your gender or your sex or your orientation matters, and you're not talking about the ERA, you shouldn't be talking at all. Go talk about something else. Go talk about trees, water. But if you're going to be out there and you want to use your sex or gender to win votes, do not exploit your identity to win my vote by saying either because you're female I should vote for you, or because you're gay I should vote for you, or whatever. Don't tell me to vote for you because you are fill in the blank unless you prioritize ERA. Women need to mobilize in that way and say to every candidate, if the first thing out of your mouth on women's issues isn't ERA, I am going to vote for someone else. And guess what? If we could get together and say that, every candidate would prioritize ERA.
Well, yeah, we are 52% of the population, and I think we vote more, and we live longer, so we're on the planet longer than the dudes, statistically. So it would seem like a no-brainer, what you're saying.
Yeah, we just need leadership. We need leadership. If there's one thing we have going for us, it's that things have gotten so bad for women that the horror stories really are shocking the conscience of the people in this country, that they really do listen a little bit more carefully, because the grotesque nature, especially of the sexual violence that's been going on, the public really has to pay attention now, from Epstein and Harvey Weinstein and some of these high-profile cases to just the kind of run-of-the-mill, you've got to be kidding, he did what to that kid? Or the stories are so grotesque. And because of the internet and social media, we do have the capacity to tell each other stories that even if the mainstream media doesn't make enough of it. And I think we're going to reach critical mass even if the powers that be don't want us to. There's only so much human tragedy and devastation that a culture can handle. 100 years ago, it was bad, but it wasn't this bad. Even 30 years ago, violence against women was bad, but it wasn't this bad. Today, and you mentioned this before, I don't like using the word incest because to me that soft pedals the fact that the rapist was your family member. I just like to call it rape. But the fact that you can now make money in your house,
yeah,
raping your kids, selling pictures and doing God knows what, and because it's so difficult to police what happens behind closed doors, and yet you can make money doing bad things behind closed doors, that has really blown the market for sexual violence out of control around the world. Literally, globally, the market went crazy. And to me, that's the explanation for the exponential increase in sexual violence rates in this country. And that's why the United States ranks third in the world, according to a UN report, not from last year. Third most dangerous, with regard to sexual violence, third most dangerous country on earth.
Third.
America.
Isn't that sick?
Third most dangerous. And that, that's the product. That's the product of inequality for women. That's the result of our failure to pass the ERA, because the space between equality and inequality is where violence against women happens with impunity under the law. If you're in that second-class space, everything between where you are and where equality is, that space in the middle, is where anybody can hurt you, and there's nothing you can do about it.
That's nothing.
That's why equality matters.
That people don't understand. I don't think the average person understands how bad it is, though. Like you're saying, I've been dosed on numerous occasions after shows. Luckily, there's been no horrible negative outcome from these situations. But I was in California at a venue, and when I finished my show, I had a glass of wine with some people who were there at the show. And next thing I knew, I was falling over and I didn't know what was going on. And I'm very fortunate that the comedian who booked me was still there and saw what was happening and got me out of there. I was followed to the car by 3 men who kept trying to get me to go with them. I think they're the ones who dosed me. And I reported that to the FBI. because that same venue had someone murdered there on its property a year before. And once I read that online, I'm like, oh, wow, this is a bad place. I went to the FBI about that. They didn't do anything. I never got a follow-up call. I had a witness to, could give evidence of what happened. And things like that happen all the time.
All the time.
I'm lucky enough that I had somebody there with me that night and protected me. But even if those guys had done something to me, nothing would have happened. Nothing would have happened to them.
If you're drugged, obviously the reason perpetrators like drugging victims is because then they can't remember very much. And if you can't remember, you can't testify. Most of the cases I've handled involving college women and rapes on campus have involved drugging, because the college kids, they know they don't want to ruin the college rapists, which are almost invariably white, wealthy, and entitled. Let's be clear, they are smart enough and wealthy enough to drug their victims for the purpose of making sure they don't get in trouble. So they'll give them they'll wait until they've had a little bit to drink, so they're not paying 100% attention to their drink. They put drugs in. Victim passes out. They deliver them to God knows where, do whatever they want with them. And then the victim has no conscious awareness of what's going on. In the morning, her body hurts from head to toe. She's certain she was raped, but she doesn't know from whom or what it involved. She doesn't think she was drugged because, for college kids in particular, they don't know what drugging feels like.
They're just learning hangovers. They're just finding out about it.
They have that hangover.
Yeah.
That's right. So they don't report it as drugging, and by the time they figure out they've been drugged, the drugs have dissipated from their blood and urine, so you can't prove it. Although a lot of my clients get their hair tested, because drugs never dissipate from hair, and there are some labs that can actually identify the moment in time with a pretty small window, the moment in time when the drugs entered the system. So there are good technologies to show drugging even months later. But I mention this only because this isn't new. It's what Bill Cosby did for years and years.
Exactly. It's been going on for decades.
Oh, my God. Yeah, as long as there have been drugs, there have been drugging rapes, because it's just common sense. If you're a perpetrator and you want to get away with it, it's better if your victim is unconscious. This is just common sense. But it still matters that prosecutors have the capacity to do more about these cases, and they choose not to. And they choose not to because they can. Politically, they get away with it because we don't hold them accountable, because most rape crisis center organizations in this country do not criticize prosecutors. They don't step up to the plate for victims.
Nope.
They get paid the VAWA money to pat victims on the head and send them to counseling and manage them into complacency and silence. They're not activists like they used to be. They're not marching in the streets. They're not criticizing the government. They're not complaining about prosecutors who don't file charges or who give away the store and allow these crazy plea bargains. So the people who should be holding government officials accountable for not effectively dealing with violence against women aren't doing it. And they're not doing their jobs. And so it's left to people who are not in organizations, but are individuals like you, Lisa, and like me, these individuals who feel strongly about these systemic problems and end up using podcasts and the internet and social media to get the word out. That's what we have to do. Mm-hmm. And it's a good thing. In a sense, the internet and the social media stuff has become beneficial. From a democracy perspective, it's a beneficial forum and platform and technology for us, because we may not ever own the New York Times, but we can speak. There's a good website that I've run with my students for a few years called campusaccountability.org. Has lots of good information about what to do if you suffer sex-based harm on campus. Mm-hmm. There is a wonderful organization called ithappenedtoalexa.org. They give money to victims who cannot afford transportation or housing or hotel expenses associated with testifying in criminal proceedings or in proceedings related to sexual violence. So, and that happens a lot, that somebody, for whatever reason, just can't the prosecutors refusing to bring them in, or maybe they were assaulted in another jurisdiction or far from their house, and the prosecutor will say, well, we can't afford to bring you in, so I'm sorry, we're going to have to drop the charges. The Alexa Foundation will give you the money to do that, and they'll pay for a support person to go with you, so you don't have to go alone. And they're a little charity in New York that very few people know about, so I like to let folks hear about them and know more about them, because they have resources to help, and you can't get the resources if you don't know about them. So that's another organization I wanted to share. Last but not least, I just want to urge people to pay attention more to areas in the law where they see that women are being subjected to second-class treatment. One of my pet peeves is the absence of sex and gender as a category in hate crimes laws around the country. In Massachusetts, for example, sex and gender are the only categories missing from our hate crimes law. We included transgender in 2012. Our current Attorney General, Mara Healey, who has aspirations for higher office, she fought hard to add transgender, but she intentionally did not try to add, and in fact has not supported at all adding sex and gender. Women suffer the most violence in this country by far because of who they are. Compared to all other categories of people, women suffer the most. And it's a no-brainer to me that they ought to be included in hate crimes laws universally. They're only in about half the state's hate crimes laws, yet they suffer the most. So what's wrong with this picture? We as women not only need to stand up for the ERA, which, by the way, if the ERA passed, would make those kinds of exclusionary hate crimes laws unconstitutional.
Mm-hmm.
But so we need to be fighting for the ERA, but also be mindful of these laws that are so explicitly discriminatory that they exclude women from protection. Hate crimes laws are a big pet peeve of mine. Women are not protected in Massachusetts. They're not protected in half the states. And no surprise, they end up suffering more because of that inadequate protection. So we have to be more mindful, definitely be more vocal, and create visibility for others to see things as well. Women's suffering has been invisible for too long. Podcasts like yours, Lisa, help to create visibility. I'm so glad you're doing this. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thank you so much for coming and talking and sharing all this new information that I had no idea about. And thank you for all the great work you're doing. And I'm really sorry that it's so bad in Massachusetts because, we have this idea that that's a blue state. It is so liberal. Of course things are better there. They can even smoke dope. And yet the reality is, nope.
Nope. Massachusetts is good for some things and really bad for women.
Well, I hope you'll come back in the future. Would you come back again?
Absolutely.
I would love that, Wendy Murphy. Wendy Murphy, how do we find you online, Wendy?
I'm the most active on Twitter, so I'm at W Murphy Law, and I teach at New England Law Boston, and I can be reached by email at wmurphy@nesl.edu. That stands for New England School of Law.
Thanks, y'all, for listening. Please come back to next WOMENACE Wednesday. You can find me on my website, lisalandry.com. Shout out, Ari. I love you, little boo-boo.